which, quote, nobody knew at the time, end quote, will it be this November? And what I'm talking about here is that the Republican Party's favorite phrase when it comes to presidential politics appears to be, well, nobody knew at the time. You know, once a president is sworn into office, regardless of how much evidence there might be that crimes and irregularities committed to get him there, both the press and the electorate just seem to want to ignore the evidence and move along. I mean, after all, there's never been a successfully contested presidency in American history, or presidential election, which is why, you know, I'm quite confident the Republican Party will again try to get away with their crimes against electoral democracy this fall. The big question for America is going to be, what did we miss that we should have known at the time? Now, we have seen this movie before. You'll recall when Richard Nixon ran against incumbent Vice President Hubert Humphrey in 1968, nobody knew at the time that Nixon's campaign had reached out to the South Vietnamese leadership and promised to make them rich if they just sabotaged the peace deal that they had agreed to with Lyndon Johnson just months earlier. A week before the election, LBJ discussed it with Senator Everett Dirksen, who said, this is treason. But both men took this to their graves. It wasn't until, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, when the Johnson Library published the recordings of the phone conversations, that we learned that Nixon had committed treason to become president in 1968. Similarly, when Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter, nobody knew at the time that Reagan's campaign had cut a deal with the mullahs of Iran to hold the hostages, making Carter appear fatally weak and politically impotent. We didn't learn about Reagan's treason until the then president of Iran, Abdul Hassan Bani Sadr, immigrated to the United States, wrote a 2013 article for the Christian Science Monitor in which he laid out the plot. And then that story was corroborated just last year in the New York Times by Texas's former Lieutenant Governor Ben Barnes, who'd been on the trip to Paris on behalf of the Reagan campaign to cut the deal with the Iranians. In the 2000 election, when that recount was ordered by the Florida Supreme Court and halted by 5 corrupt Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court, handing the White House to George W. Bush with the disputed 537 votes, nobody knew at the time that Florida Governor Jeb Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, had commissioned a huge purge of voters using a list of Texas felons that was 68% black and Hispanic. Harris did this because the national pool of black and Hispanic names is relatively small. So black felons in Texas with names like Jim Washington or Jose Gonzalez are extremely likely to have similarly named counterparts in any state with large black and Hispanic populations like Florida. Thus, when those Texas names were compared via a loose match, Harris didn't require a middle name match or a birthday match. With Florida voters' names, disproportionate numbers of black and Hispanic Florida voters got identified as, these are Texas felons who must have moved to Florida. And they got thrown off the voting rolls. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights noted, and I quote, 14.4% of Florida's black voters cast ballots that were rejected. This compares with approximately 1.6% of non-black Florida voters who did not have their presidential votes counted. In the state's largest county, Miami-Dade, more than 65% of the names on the purge list were African Americans, who represent only 20.4% of the Florida population. So, you know, we didn't know when George W. Bush, quote, won the election that his brother had thrown 90,000 African Americans off the voting rolls in Florida just 6 months earlier. Well, now we know, George W. Bush was an illegitimate president. Ronald Reagan was an illegitimate president. Richard Nixon was an illegitimate president. Nixon and Reagan committed treason to win. George W. Bush just committed good old-fashioned election fraud. And then when Donald Trump was certified the winner of the 2016 election, nobody knew at the time that Russia had illegally poured millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of man-hours into targeting swing state voters who had been identified by the RNC, whose names were handed off to Russian intelligence by Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. When Robert Mueller's FBI team determined that that crime put Trump in the White House, and that Trump had personally intervened in investigations 10 separate times in ways that could be prosecuted for criminal obstruction of justice, Bill Barr kept the news from America until the story had largely faded from the headlines. So what's it going to be this fall? What's going to be the little trick that the Republicans play, or the big trick? You know, is it going to be interference in foreign affairs? Is it going to be, you know, foreign allies helping out, like Russia helping Trump in 2016? Is it, you know, what's it going to be? Well, we've got some clues. You know, first off, with the blessing of 5 Republicans on the 2018 Supreme Court, Republican-controlled states with large Black and Hispanic populations are purging voter rolls like there's no tomorrow. Just between 2020 and 2022, 2 years, fully 19,260,000 Americans, 8.5% of all registered voters, were purged. And the purge rate in red states is 40% higher than in blue states. And we won't know the purge numbers until after the election. So there's that. The Republican Party right now is trying to organize an army of 100,000 so-called poll watchers who are going to, you know, election integrity people, who are going to challenge suspicious-looking people who might show up at the polls to vote, and who are going to be challenging the match of the signatures on mail-in ballots coming out of blue parts of the states. So there's that. Republican officials at the state level, all the way up to the U.S. Senate, are refusing to say whether they'll accept or certify the results of an election this fall if Trump loses. Multiple members of Congress have asserted that only the House of Representatives should decide the election, which of course would throw that to Trump. In multiple states, Republicans have passed laws allowing them to manipulate and change the location of polling places, criminalize voter registration drives, replace Democratic and nonpartisan election officials with partisan GOP hacks, and in Georgia and Arizona, throw out ballots from entire precincts. The Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt noted for The Atlantic, quote, throwing out thousands of ballots in rival strongholds may be profoundly anti-democratic, but it is technically legal. And Republicans in several states now have a powerful stick with which to enforce such practices. Right. Then there's also, you know, historically, when politicians get caught cheating, that kills their political chances. But since 2016, and in a big way since 2020, when Republicans are caught cheating, they actually get rewarded by their voters rather than punished. So there's that. Saudi Arabia and Russia, both allies of Trump, have cut oil production by more than 1.4 million barrels a day to drive up gas prices leading up to the November election, just like they did during that dress rehearsal in 2022. Remember those? History shows that when gas prices spike over $5 or $6 a gallon, it'll have a huge impact on the election. So there's that. And then Russia fielded a small army of online trolls to assist Trump's efforts in 2016 and 2020. Expect the same this November, except this time, according to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, China is also getting into the act on the Republican Party's behalf. And finally, Benjamin Netanyahu defied Obama when he was engaged in delicate negotiations with Iran, visiting the U.S. and addressing Congress at the invitation of Republicans. He's expected to do the same slap-in-the-face gesture against Biden this fall, along with defying the president's wish that Israel minimize civilian casualties in Gaza. Netanyahu will do anything he can to ensure Trump gets back into office, if for no other reason than keeping himself out of prison.
1 minute.
So demoralizing young progressive voters will almost certainly be at the top of Netanyahu's list. But these are just the things we know about right now. What are the things we don't know about? Is there anything on your mind? Can you think of something that I've missed here? What will it be that we will look back on if Donald Trump becomes president this November and is sworn in January? A year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, what will be the thing that we look back on and say, oh, that's how he stole the election?